The Zephyrian Empire had spent the better part of 3 millennia perfecting the art of diplomatic intimidation. Their approach was elegantly simple: arrive with overwhelming force, deliver ultimatums wrapped in flowery language, and watch lesser species crumble under the weight of their own inadequacy. It was a system that had worked flawlessly across 700 star systems, turning potential conflicts into bureaucratic footnotes with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The Empire prided itself on being civilized, which in their vocabulary meant they preferred to threaten annihilation through proper channels, rather than simply vaporizing planets without warning. Such restraint, they believed, separated them from the barbaric tendencies of younger species who still solve problems with crude violence. The Zephyrians had evolved beyond such primitive impulses, developing instead a sophisticated framework of coercion that allowed them to maintain their moral superiority while still getting exactly what they wanted. Their diplomatic corps was legendary throughout the galaxy, trained in the subtle art of making threats sound like generous offers and ultimatums feel like friendly suggestions. Ambassador Kethloran in particular had made a career out of reducing proud civilizations to sniveling compliance with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a carefully modulated tone of disappointment. His success rate was so impressive that younger diplomats studied recordings of his negotiations like sacred texts. The Zephyrian fleet that approached Earth's outer system was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, disguised as diplomatic protocol. 7 massive dreadnoughts, arranged in a formation that looked casual but was precisely calculated to project overwhelming superiority. Each vessel bristled with weapons that could crack continents, their hulls gleaming with the kind of perfect polish that suggested unlimited resources and obsessive attention to detail. The message was clear: resistance would be not just futile, but embarrassingly short-lived. Earth's response to this display of force was, by galactic standards, refreshingly direct. They sent a single communication to the lead vessel: "Welcome to Sol System. Please proceed to Station Harmony for diplomatic proceedings. Coffee will be provided." The casualness of the response was so unexpected that Kethloran spent several minutes parsing the message for hidden meanings, before concluding that humans were either supremely confident or catastrophically naive. Station Harmony itself was a testament to human practicality over aesthetics. Where other species built diplomatic facilities to inspire awe, humans had constructed what appeared to be a glorified office building with docking bays. The interior was decorated with the kind of aggressively neutral color scheme that suggested someone had given up on making an impression and settled for not actively offending anyone. The conference room featured a table that looked like it had been purchased from a catalog, and chairs that prioritized function over comfort. Ambassador Kethloran and his entourage entered the station with the kind of measured dignity that came from centuries of practice. They were met by a human delegation that seemed almost comically ordinary by comparison. The lead negotiator, a woman named Director Reynolds, wore what appeared to be a standard business suit and carried herself with the kind of professional competence that suggested she might have been equally comfortable discussing quarterly reports or interstellar conquest. The formal presentation of the ultimatum proceeded exactly as it had on hundreds of other worlds. Kethloran's voice carried the perfect balance of regret and inevitability as he outlined the Empire's requirements. Earth would submit to Zephyrian oversight, restructure their government according to approved templates, and provide tribute in the form of resources and technology. The alternative, delivered with the kind of sorrowful finality that suggested the Empire would be genuinely disappointed to resort to violence, was the complete sterilization of their biosphere. Director Reynolds listened to the ultimatum with the kind of polite attention one might give to a particularly long-winded weather report. She took notes on what appeared to be actual paper, asked a few clarifying questions about taxation schedules, and nodded thoughtfully at the timeline for compliance. When Kethloran finished his presentation, she thanked him for his thoroughness and assured him that Earth would give his proposal the consideration it deserved. The Zephyrian delegation departed with the satisfied confidence of professionals who had executed a routine task with characteristic excellence. They established a blockade at the system's edge and settled in to wait for the inevitable capitulation. Based on their extensive experience with similar situations, They estimated that Earth would require approximately 72 hours to process their denial, work through the various stages of grief, and arrive at the logical conclusion that submission was their only viable option. What the Zephyrians failed to understand was that humans approached problem-solving with a fundamentally different methodology. Where other species might spend their time desperately searching for alternatives or attempting to negotiate better terms, humans had immediately shifted into what their military called practical planning mode. The question wasn't whether they would comply with the ultimatum, but rather how to most efficiently eliminate the threat while sending a clear message about their position on future negotiations. General Martinez, Earth's senior military commander, convened a planning session that would have seemed disturbingly casual to any observer familiar with traditional military protocol. The atmosphere was less preparing for war and more organizing a particularly complex business trip. Officers discussed logistics with the kind of matter-of-fact efficiency that suggested they were solving a routine technical problem rather than planning what amounted to interstellar terrorism. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to match the Zephyrian Empire's military might or engaging in the kind of prolonged diplomatic dance that might eventually lead to a marginally better deal, Earth would deliver a response that was both unambiguous and impossible to misinterpret. They would demonstrate their position on ultimatums by making it clear that threatening humanity carried personal consequences for those involved. Intelligence gathered on Zephyrian psychology revealed several useful vulnerabilities. The Empire's diplomatic corps was composed entirely of individuals from their highest social strata, beings who had never experienced genuine physical danger or contemplated their own mortality in any meaningful way. They were, in human terms, completely unprepared for the kind of direct personal violence that Earth was prepared to deploy. More importantly, their culture placed enormous emphasis on the sanctity of diplomatic immunity, making any violation of that principle a profound psychological shock. The human diplomatic mission that departed Earth 48 hours later was a masterpiece of misdirection. The vessel appeared to be a standard diplomatic transport, its hull bearing the appropriate insignia and its crew manifesting all the bureaucratic credentials that interstellar protocol required. The cargo bay contained what appeared to be cultural gifts and formal documents, all properly sealed and documented according to Zephyrian customs. The delegation itself was led by Ambassador Thompson, a career diplomat whose credentials were impeccable and whose manner suggested the kind of refined cultural sensitivity that the Empire appreciated in their negotiations. His team appeared to be a standard mix of political advisors, cultural attachés, and administrative staff. What the Zephyrians couldn't have known was that every member of the delegation possessed advanced military training and had been selected specifically for their ability to blend seamlessly into diplomatic environments, while maintaining the capacity for extreme violence. The journey to Zephyros Prime took 18 days, during which the human delegation maintained perfect diplomatic protocol. They submitted to all security scans, participated in cultural exchange programs, and even attended a reception hosted by the Zephyros Ministry of External Affairs. Ambassador Thompson's conversations with his hosts were models of diplomatic courtesy, touching on everything from trade agreements to cultural preservation programs. The formal presentation of Earth's response was scheduled to take place in the Empire's most prestigious diplomatic facility, a building that served as both a symbol of Zephyrian cultural achievement and a practical workspace for their most important negotiations. The architecture was designed to inspire awe, with soaring ceilings, crystalline walls, and acoustic engineering that made every word resonate with ceremonial significance. The Zephyrian leadership assembled for the occasion represented the pinnacle of their diplomatic establishment. Fleet Admiral Zethcaron, the architect of their expansion policy, sat alongside Senior Counselor Vaithara, whose negotiations had brought dozens of species into the Empire's embrace. The atmosphere was one of professional anticipation, with the kind of satisfied confidence that came from a lifetime of successful intimidation. Ambassador Thompson began his presentation with all the appropriate ceremonial flourishes, acknowledging the Empire's greatness and expressing gratitude for their patient consideration of humanity's position. He spoke eloquently about the challenges of interstellar diplomacy and the importance of clear communication between species with different cultural backgrounds. The Zephyrians listened with the kind of polite attention that suggested they were already mentally preparing for the next phase of the negotiation. The formal presentation of Earth's response began with the unveiling of what appeared to be ceremonial gifts. The containers were works of art in themselves, crafted from materials that would have been considered precious on any world and decorated with intricate patterns that suggested deep cultural significance. Each container was approximately the size of a small storage unit, sealed with what appeared to be some form of preservation technology. Ambassador Thompson's explanation of the gifts was a masterpiece of diplomatic doublespeak. He spoke about the importance of personal connection in interstellar relations and humanity's commitment to ensuring that their message would be received with the appropriate level of clarity. The containers, he explained, represented Earth's response to the Empire's generous offer and their hope that future negotiations would be conducted with a deeper understanding of humanity's cultural values. The moment of revelation came when the first container was opened. The preservation field dissipated with a soft hiss, revealing its contents to the assembled Zephyrian leadership. What they saw was the perfectly preserved head of Ambassador Kethloran, his expression frozen in the kind of surprise that suggested he had not anticipated this particular outcome when he had delivered his ultimatum at Station Harmony. The reaction was everything human intelligence had predicted and more. The Zephyrian leadership, beings who had spent their entire lives insulated from physical violence by layers of protocol and privilege, found themselves confronting the kind of direct, personal brutality that their culture had convinced them was extinct. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating, with several senior officials requiring medical attention for what appeared to be some form of traumatic shock. The second container held the head of senior diplomat Reth Moran, who had been responsible for drafting the specific terms of Earth's ultimatum. The third contained Fleet Coordinator Nex Thul, whose logistics expertise had made the blockade of Earth's system possible. Each subsequent container revealed another member of the diplomatic mission, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright terror, as they had evidently begun to understand their fate. Ambassador Thompson's explanation of the gesture was delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that made the horror even more profound. He spoke about humanity's commitment to personal accountability in diplomatic relations, and their belief that those who made threats should be prepared to face the consequences of their actions. The heads, he explained, represented Earth's formal response to the Empire's ultimatum and their hope that future negotiations would be conducted with a more realistic understanding of the costs involved. The immediate aftermath was chaos of the kind that the Zephyrian Empire had not experienced in centuries. Their most senior diplomatic officials were either dead or in various states of psychological collapse. Their military leadership was struggling to process the implications of humanity's response, and their entire framework for understanding interstellar relations had been shattered by a single, brutally effective demonstration. The Empire's initial response was predictably outraged. Emergency sessions were called, military units were mobilized, and proclamations were issued declaring humanity to be a threat to galactic civilization. The rhetoric was impressive in its fury, with speeches comparing humans to various forms of galactic plague and demanding immediate punitive action. The problem was that underneath the bluster, the Empire's leadership was genuinely terrified of what they had unleashed. The psychological impact of the human response rippled through the Empire's power structure in ways that military force never could have achieved. The realization that their diplomats could be hunted down and killed with apparent ease had fundamentally altered the calculus of their expansion strategy. Suddenly, the cost of issuing ultimatums included the very real possibility of personal consequences for those involved. Other species throughout the galaxy watched the proceedings with a mixture of horror and fascination. The human approach to diplomacy was so far outside established norms that many governments found themselves unable to formulate appropriate responses. Some condemned the brutality, others secretly admired the effectiveness, and a few began quietly reassessing their own relationships with the Empire in light of humanity's demonstration. The Zephyrian military's response was hampered by the same psychological factors that had made the attack so effective. Their commanders, drawn from the same social strata as their diplomatic corps, found themselves confronting the possibility that humans might extend their demonstration to include military leadership. The prospect of personal danger introduced a level of caution that had been absent from their calculations for centuries. Earth's follow-up communications were masterpieces of diplomatic courtesy wrapped around cores of absolute menace. Director Reynolds sent formal condolences for the Empire's losses, while expressing hope that future negotiations would be conducted with a better understanding of humanity's cultural values. The subtext was clear. Threats against Earth would result in personal consequences for those who made them. The standoff that followed lasted several weeks, during which the Empire struggled to develop a response that would restore their credibility without provoking another demonstration of human effectiveness. Their military advisors recommended immediate retaliation, but their intelligence services warned that humanity had demonstrated capabilities that made traditional military responses potentially catastrophic for Imperial leadership. The resolution came in the form of a face-saving compromise that allowed the Empire to withdraw their ultimatum while maintaining the pretense that they had achieved their objectives. Earth agreed to participate in a cultural exchange program and to establish formal diplomatic relations with the Empire. In exchange, the blockade was lifted and the threat of military action was quietly forgotten. The final irony was that the Empire's propaganda machine managed to present the entire episode as a successful demonstration of their diplomatic flexibility. Official records described the incident as a cultural misunderstanding that had been resolved through patient negotiation and mutual respect. The fact that their most senior diplomats had been systematically murdered was relegated to classified reports that few officials had the clearance to read. The galaxy's new understanding of human diplomacy was summed up in a classified intelligence briefing that circulated among senior officials throughout known space. Humans appear to view diplomacy as a form of warfare conducted by other means. Traditional approaches to intimidation are not recommended. Suggest extreme caution in future negotiations. The Zephyrian Empire continued to expand their influence throughout the galaxy, but their methods became noticeably more restrained when dealing with species that had demonstrated the capacity for extreme violence. The age of casual ultimatums had ended, replaced by a more cautious approach that took into account the possibility that some civilizations might respond to threats with the kind of direct, personal retaliation that had characterized humanity's diplomatic debut. Earth, meanwhile, established itself as a species that other civilizations approached with a mixture of respect and apprehension. Their diplomatic corps developed a reputation for being unfailingly polite, professionally competent, and absolutely ruthless when circumstances required it. The galaxy learned that humans were perfectly capable of participating in civilized discourse, but that their definition of appropriate responses to threats differed significantly from established norms. The ultimate lesson of the incident was that in a galaxy where most species had evolved beyond direct violence, the willingness to embrace brutality when necessary could be a surprisingly effective diplomatic tool. The Empire had assumed that their superiority in conventional warfare would guarantee compliance, but they had failed to account for humanity's willingness to ignore conventional limitations when their survival was at stake. In the end, the Zephyrian Empire's attempt to intimidate Earth had resulted in a fundamental shift in the galaxy's power dynamics. The age of diplomatic ultimatums, backed by overwhelming force, had given way to a more cautious era, where the personal consequences of aggressive negotiation had to be carefully weighed against potential benefits. The Empire remained powerful, but their power was now tempered by the knowledge that some species would respond to threats with the kind of direct, personal violence that their culture had convinced them was extinct. The heads of their top ambassadors served as a permanent reminder that in the vast diversity of galactic civilization, there were still species for whom diplomacy was just another form of warfare, and warfare was something they were very, very good at.